So thank you very much for inviting me, my brilliant colleagues. I'm thrilled to be here, challenging some of the misperceptions around leadership. And I really enjoyed Phil's presentation, and I absolutely agree with the points he's making. And you'll sort of get that from later on in my presentation. But the main thrust of what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be challenging the very common misperception that we can understand leadership purely through the lens of personality, traits and preferences. And I'm going to sort of offer a different perspective on what leadership is really all about. And so if we want to sort of effectively select, promote, develop the most effective leaders, we need to look beyond personality as well. My background is I'm a chartered occupational psychologist. I run Real World Group. We've been around for 20 years. We're a University of Leeds spin-out company. You may be familiar with our founding director, Professor Juliette Alban-Metcalfe. If you haven't heard of us, these are some people who have heard of us. These are who we've worked with over the last several years. So we work in all different sectors. What we exist to do is to conduct research around what creates sustainable high performance in organizations in terms of individual behaviors, team behaviors, board behaviors, and so on. We then create assessment tools that other organizations can use with their clients or internally, and they're distributed in 17 different countries. So in terms of understanding their personality and leadership, I wanted to sort of first of all ask about, I'm not going to actually ask, but I'd like you to reflect on, based on everything that you know about personality and leadership and your experience of working with different assessment tools, how much of personality do you understand can be, how much of performance, I should say, do you understand can be predicted by personality? So your choices are, do you think 90% of performance in roles predicted by personality, 75%, 50%, 25%, or 10%? So just reflect on that for a moment. So the answer is 10%. And there's a very interesting meta-analysis of studies by Baez, which I'd be happy to share with you if you're interested. So that probably is a surprise to most people. In my experience, it certainly is. And it was a huge surprise to me too, even though I've always been more focused on the behavioral approach to leadership. And it's particularly a surprise given the size of the personality assessment market. It's enormous. It's worth at least $500 million a year, just in the US alone. And of course, what we learn from the tests and assessments that are available is that they were regarded as a huge number of applications to it. And certainly it gets applied a lot in terms of leadership. So let's explore then why personality is actually a fairly poor predictor of performance in roles. A bit of a tongue twister. Let's start by thinking about how we understand individuals and how we go about predicting, what might lead to the holy grail of sustainable high performance. So as psychologists, when we think about individuals, we start by, recognizing the values that they have at the core of their selves. So values, of course, are typically instilled in childhood or early development. Of course, as you grow into adults, your different experiences and influences and so on, you might reject the values that you were initially instilled in you, and you might develop your own, but certainly you'll have values at the core of your being. They then tend to develop into attitudes around how the world should be, how it shouldn't be, how people should be, how you should be, how things shouldn't be, which then in turn is expressed to, through our personality. So in what motivates us, what excites us, what turns us off, what our preferences are for doing or being, those are expressed through our personality. And then, of course, the personality then leads to the visible behaviors. So if you think about an individual as an iceberg, then the behavior stuff is the physical manifestation of those other attributes about us. Okay, but now the only way that you're going to get a really strong correlation between just even the personality and the person's manifested behavior is if they live in a vacuum. But actually, we know that, we have to adapt our behavior all the time in order to live harmoniously with other people. If we think about family conflict, it often arises from different personality types or preferences. So to live harmoniously, we have to adapt our behavior. And it's even more complicated in a work context. In a work context, there is the correlation between personality and behavior and performance is intervened, or is kind of, is broken down by workplace factors. So workplace factors, and I'll show you what I mean in a moment, are things that mean that we're not able to behave in line with how we might prefer to, or what our key motivations and drivers are. And the kind of workplace factors I'm talking about are things like the global context. I mean, my goodness, what a fantastic example, well, a devastating example COVID-19 has been in explaining, or demonstrating how the global context affects all of us, but it's always been the case. Then there's the organizational context and priorities, what's required from us in our role. What our specific role requires of us, and that might change over time, even when things are less turbulent than they are at the moment. Then, of course, there's what our colleagues need from us, there's what our team members need from us, and then there are ongoing demands that kind of flow in, or fly in, I should say, from day to day, and many other things. And so that is the reason why personality is not a brilliant predictor of performance in role, because it's much more complicated than that. However, being a little bit less controversial than how I started, personality assessments can be valuable. Don't get me wrong, they can be valuable. For example, when you're selecting somebody into a leadership, we'll focus on leadership specifically. When you're selecting someone into a leadership role, it can be really useful to understand whether they have the motivations, the sort of aptitude, the preferences that suit that particular role. Whether, it can be very useful in helping people to understand that the world is viewed very differently by us based on, our core selves. And also it can really help in terms of communication. So there are many ways in which personality assessments and the different varieties of it, whether it's, a kind of a Belbin variety or a disc or a wave, or, whatever, they can be useful in a number of different ways. The key thing is that they are typically overestimated in what they can do, especially in terms of leadership. So what do we need to look at instead? If you go back to this little steps diagram, then what we can explore and what we can understand, much more about in terms of predicting performance is the behavior aspect. The key drivers of human effort, particularly the ones that we need right now, are not influenced by leader personality. They're actually more influenced by behavior. So what are these key drivers of human effort? Well, the first one, of course, is meaning, and both Phil and Nigel have referred to this. We know that people will sort of follow the direction we want them to, will give their effort and their best to undertakings if they have a sense of meaning in the work that they do, if they understand how their role, no matter how far removed it is from the final product or service, whatever it is that the organization is providing, they understand how it contributes, and if they feel that it's a valuable contribution. And part of giving people a sense of meaning is also, as Nigel referred to, it's giving them a sense of hope and purpose in the work that they do. And we know in an era of huge turbulence caused by COVID, that a lot of people's jobs have been transformed. So we need to help them to revisit and re-establish meaning in their work. As human beings, we really want autonomy. We are beings, I should say, that desire predictability and control. So most people, would like a degree of autonomy in the work that they do. So how can we as leaders give people permission to make decisions? How can we create leaders around us rather than creating dependency? Now, if you invite people to sort of expand on the areas they're responsible for without supporting them through coaching and mentoring, in other words, establishing a sense of mastery, it's disastrous. There's nothing more stressful than being given a new objective and you really don't feel confident in doing it. So leaders need to establish mastery through coaching and mentoring, but also by instilling belief in people. It's amazing how many leaders, through their behavior, destroy people's sense of self-confidence and self-esteem, and often so unintentionally. Then, of course, appreciation is critical. People need to feel valued and noticed for the contribution that they're making. They need to feel psychologically safe, that they can make suggestions. They need to be invited to question the status quo and how we can do things differently. And again, Nigel and Philip referred to these. And they must feel a sense of social support, both from the leader, but also from team members. Now, when leaders can create a culture that are characterized by those factors in their teams, then leadership emerges within the team, and the team becomes, is leadership. It's not just then relying on the leader, the formal leader of the organization or the department or the team. Okay, so those are the key aspects of culture that we need in organizations right now. And if we can create those within teams, then we know from research and also from practical application that we'll get higher readiness for change, which, as Nigel mentioned, the world will continue to be turbulent. So we need that desperately. High levels of innovation, high levels of resilience, actual output performance, but also critically, and what makes this sustainable is it also increases people's levels of well-being. Now, if personality doesn't predict that a leader can create those conditions of that culture within a team and therefore enhance leadership, as a social activity as opposed to a formal activity, then what does? And our research over the last 20 years has been looking at what are the simple, common sense, day-to-day leadership behaviors that create the conditions for sustainable high performance in organizations. And we have a model of leadership which has 98 different dimensions. I'll talk to you about the research behind it very briefly in a moment. But just to give you a feel that regardless of sector, and so far in the research, regardless of country, there are some really basic things that people need to engage in that will make a huge difference to people's experience. And they're, all of those different factors we talked about just now in terms of wanting to contribute the very best. The first sort of set of behaviours are around showing genuine concern. This very much aligns with what Phil was just saying. We deliberately called this group of behaviours showing genuine concern because showing concern can often be not genuine. And that contains behaviours that refer to things like coaching and mentoring people, having positive expectations of them, which is, as I said, can often be missing. Then there's the non-hierarchical behaviours, and there's delegating with understanding of people's aspirations and their hopes and their strengths and so on. And then encouraging change is actually about encouraging questioning, people to dissent from the status quo, and to offer critical feedback of both the organisation and the individual. Moving quickly on, looking at the time, there's also a group of behaviours that are critical on a day-to-day basis around creating a developmental rather than a blame culture. So the ways in which leaders do that, inspiring others, not through being charismatic. I think, as Phil mentioned, charisma, actually, when you look at the research, it does not correlate with performance. If you're a brilliant leader and you're charismatic, then fantastic. But charismatic people do not necessarily make great leaders, but that often isn't well enough understood. But it's about creating, as Nigel said, passion and hope for the future. We believe it's going to happen, even if we're not charismatic as leaders. About being clear about people's expectations, and a whole group of behaviours around being decisive and taking risks as appropriate. And then second to last, there are a group of behaviours that relate to, getting stakeholders involved in creating a shared vision of what success looks like and how we're going to get there. Networking for the good of the organisation rather than individual gain. I won't talk about the other two, but finally, just very quickly, at the core, again, the kind of things that Phil and Nigel talked about, it's about being a person of huge integrity. That there are behaviours in there that refer to things like that you regard the good of the organisation as more important than achieving personal ambition, that you're willing to admit when you make a mistake. That these are the ways that we weed out the technical term that Nigel used, arseholes, basically, because these things don't just come by accident. They come because we select for people like this, we promote people like this, and we develop people like this. So there's tons of research behind this, and this is, I guess, when you're looking at how you might assess and develop in the future, always look at the research evidence. There are a lot of personality tools that are able to demonstrate that they're measuring robust constructs, whether it's the kind of the disc type things or whatever. But then you've got to find out, do they actually have evidence of predictive validity? Can they actually show through peer-reviewed research, does it actually do anything in terms of, or does it predict anything valuable in terms of performance for the or whatever it is that you're seeking to achieve in the organisation? And then finally, of course, what we also have in terms of our research is applied evidence. And I've just given some examples of some safety conscious, well, particularly safety conscious sectors, because colleagues will be talking about safety later on. But we know that when you behave in this way, your organizations do have high levels of innovation. They have, they cut costs, they do things faster, they have more safe environments. I mean, I don't have time to talk about specific examples, but what I would like to say in conclusion is that even though personality tools are incredibly widely used, please be aware that they're not a silver bullet, and it's important to look at other factors too. So I shall hand over for any questions or comments.
Thanks, Jules. Yeah, it's an interest. It's such an interesting area. I mean, you and I talk about this a lot, but it is such an interesting area. A question came in about why is it then that we're so seduced by this charismatic personality thing? That whenever I ask a group, and I always do, to come up with examples of great leaders, I always get the same 10 people. And most of them are these incredible, legendary, historical figures. That's not much use to us because very few of us can aspire to be like that anyway, even if it was going to be useful. But my bit I particularly picked up on from what you're saying is this thing that we keep promoting these people. And we keep rewarding those behaviors because we still think that management is about getting people to do stuff. Yeah, that it's about getting them to do more of that stuff, ideally, so we can make more money. And I wonder, to what is there actually so much self-interest in carrying on the way we are that we can't fix it? What do you think?
You mean in terms of the sort of charisma factor and the ways that we
and the personality focus?
Well, I mean, I think there's always a risk when you talk about these kind of things that you offend people who have preferred personality assessments. And so I hope I've been clear that they do have great utility in certain ways, but we do need to, stop using them as the be all and end all when it comes to selection and recruitment. It's the same even if you include also a measure of emotional intelligence, you're still not getting the full picture of what a leader needs to do to be effective in role, especially in the incredibly difficult times that we have. So I think it's a question about people, looking around what's available that will enable us to look more deeply than these factors that are readily available, and that which, and look again at the claims that firms make about, as I said before, predictability is a really important thing to look into. A test might look great and feel great and people enjoy undertaking it, but actually whether it tells you anything that's useful in terms of predicting the future can be a completely different question. And so exploring, that kind of thing, I think questioning is important. The thing about charisma is that unfortunately, even the best designed assessment centers and assessment center, specialists can fall prey to charisma, overshadowing a lack of competence, because as human beings, we are very susceptible to charisma. And I think the reason why it perpetuates is because, it is the charismatic leaders that you hear about. I think charismatic leadership and politics is a separate issue. I think that charisma can be very important in terms of, progressing one's career in politics, but it certainly is not related to performance in organizations. It's kind of an added bonus if it exists,
that brings in a whole thing about becoming obsessed with the way things look, which Phil also mentioned, that we're concerned with how things look. My experience often with leaders in organizations at all levels has been that they're more bothered about what other people think about what they're doing than they are about whether it's the right thing to do. And once you're in that place, you are screwed because you're doing things for entirely the wrong reasons. They're busy looking over their own shoulders at what their boss thinks or what their peer group thinks, instead of thinking about what's the right thing. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's true. Effective leadership requires self-confidence, as I think both you and Phil have referred to already.
There's a bravery thing in there, isn't there?
Say that again, sorry?
There's a bravery thing in there, someone having enough courage to actually go against the accepted wisdom.
Yeah, but if you have, if your belief in what the organization does and your integrity is there, then courage will feel less uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting questions coming in on the chat and getting some responses too. So I won't pick up on all of them right just yet, but thank you for that. And I think it introduces a whole area. You're right that people do tend to affiliate themselves to a particular tool, or organizations do, and often wonder how much critical thinking there's been in that process. It goes back to what Phil was saying about ticking boxes. Sometimes we need some kind of a profiling thing. There's one. Yeah. And actually, when you ask them questions about it, they don't even know what it does. They just tick their box to say they've got one now. I've seen organizations use them in preparing for an interview and then never give the candidate an example of it. So it's kind of like, well, is it a magic wand or a secret spell? What is it that we're doing here? And we just need to keep our common sense head on, don't we? And think about this, step back from it and think of it like people, sort of systemizing, and was it Phil's word, managerializing everything.
Yeah, well, let's critically evaluate things, because leadership is so critical to all of organizational success that we need to take it as seriously as we would anything else that we implement, in terms of how we develop and select it, and that's where I find it really strange, even in, things like the healthcare system, people take sort of leadership diagnostics much less seriously than they would, the analysis of drugs or treatments, but yet it does have an impact, a major impact on mortality levels. So why is it not taken seriously?